Hey, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be continuing on our series about how to get your kids involved in the kitchen. Be sure to check out my first video about why you should be getting your kids to help in the kitchen. And today we're going to be talking about kitchen safety for kids. So let's break this up into 3 parts. First, we're going to be talking about safety in prepping the kitchen. The first thing you want to do is make sure your child's hair is pulled back from their face. Of course, if you have a child who has short hair, this might not apply to you. You basically don't want the hair falling into the food or your child to be messing with it, because your hair is going to be holding on to a lot of bacteria and dirt, and you want your hands to stay clean. So first, make sure to pull your kid's hair back away from their face. The second thing you want to do is wash your hands. Make sure you're washing your hands after you put your hair back. For the same reason I just mentioned, you don't want to be washing your hands, then touching your hair, then you're just going to need to wash your hands again. These are things you need to stress with your kids about the things that they're touching and doing after they have washed their hands. Make sure that they're not recontaminating them continuously. Alright, our next step is, actually it's not too much about safety in the kitchen, but it does help in the whole process and helps keep your kids' clothes clean. So the next step is to just put on an apron. I can't get my kids to stop getting their hands dirty and then wiping it on themselves, which I actually do this too when I'm wearing an apron. So I just make sure that they have their apron on. It also puts everybody in the mood, gets them ready to start helping in the kitchen anyways, so it's a good practice that we always do. The next section is all about safety in the kitchen. The first thing you want to check is to make sure that raw meats and egg products are not contaminating other areas that you're working with as well. So for instance, if you're cutting up chicken on a cutting board, you don't want to also be using that same knife in the cutting board for other raw veggies that won't be getting cooked later or something like that. I always make sure those things get washed right away. In fact, I even have a designated cutting board just for raw meats and things so that there's never that cross-contamination. Same with your hands. If you're messing with raw meat, go ahead and wash your hands. Even if you're still working with stuff, you don't want to be having to touch handles and knobs for the stove and then just taking all of those raw materials that's on your hands now and putting them around the kitchen. So keep those raw foods from contaminating other areas. Alright, the next thing is when you're using a knife, or when your children's using a knife, to make sure that they're keeping their eyes on the work. This is one thing I have to stress with my kids because I also teach them to look at me when I'm instructing them, but I have to remind them in this instance they definitely need to be watching what they're doing even if I'm instructing them. So keep their eyes on their work and their fingers tucked away around the knife and always watching where the blade is cutting. These are obvious things, but also to stress this, even when my toddler, say, is cutting up a banana with a butter knife, I go ahead and stress these same things, even though he's not at risk for really hurting himself with this knife, but he is already setting himself up for good, safe habits when using a knife. Also, general rule of thumb, even if your child knows what they're doing generally and they're still pretty young, I always never allow them to use the oven or the stove without supervision for obvious reasons. We don't want things to go bad. I also make it a point to always make them use 2 oven mitts whenever they're getting something out of the oven. Even if it's just a small tray of cookies, I had a bad habit of, I would just grab it with 1 mitt, get it out of the oven, and set it down. But you don't want your kids to do that, and I let them do this once. My daughter, she went and grabbed the cookie sheet out of the oven, but then as soon as she got it out, she went and grabbed it with her other hand. This one didn't have an oven mitt on it. So learn from my mistakes. Always use 2 oven mitts just for safety reasons all the way around. Also, next, make sure you're keeping all other objects and containers, rags, anything that you're using away from the stovetop when you're using it. Always ask your kids to look at the area and make sure that they're not going to accidentally melt something or catch something on fire, or who knows, just make sure that the area always stays clear. This also goes with your supervision, but if you see something, call it to their attention so that they already have that habit of looking around the area and marking it as safe in their head, not just you doing it. My next tip is to use a step stool for smaller children. Even though my son is 8, sometimes I still have him use a step just to get him up waist level to the countertop. When stirring things on the stove or even at the table and when cutting things, they'll have a lot more control and not make as many mistakes or potentially harm themselves or hurt themselves if they're at waist level and they have more control. So instead of them having to be up here, it's just more awkward for them. So I always make sure they have a step. I just use a basic folding step stool in our household, nothing fancy. I know they have steps that have a bar so that they can't fall down. This is this extra step that you can definitely take. I don't do this because we do live in a small house, so I want something that's going to fold up and be easy to store. Alright, the next section is all about cleanup. This is a big part of cooking in the kitchen. We always want to make sure we're following all of the safety protocols when cleaning up as well. So the first step is to make sure that all of your appliances are either turned off or unplugged, and to also remind your children that the stovetop will remain hot for a little while. So to continue safe practices, I always say just always assume that the stovetop is going to be hot, even if you're not cooking in the kitchen. Always assume that it's going to be hot and you will avoid accidents. Your next step is going to be to clean up all of your dishes thoroughly and your workspace. This goes without saying. Wash all of the dishes with hot soapy water, as well as any of the countertops. Even though if you use a cutting board to say cut up meat, you want to wash the countertop around that area because you don't know what juices might have splashed or what you may have touched and contaminated those areas. So just go ahead and clean off the entire workspace, resetting your kitchen for the next time you go to cook in the kitchen. The last thing you want to do is to wash your hands again and then either put away or clean your apron. The apron was there to catch messes, so if it's dirty, go ahead and just throw that in the wash for next time and you'll be ready to go. I have a kitchen safety checklist for kids available to download. Just check out the link down there. While you're there, go ahead, like this video and hit subscribe to see more content like this. Make sure to follow along and continue on this series with me about how to get your kids involved in the kitchen. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.